Good evening. One of the largest defense contractors in Europe is making a play for a piece of this country's military market.
We're very much interested in the offer by Saab over the Gripen and the creation of jobs in Canada.
Donald Trump, you may have heard that the Carney government is reconsidering its multi-billion-dollar purchase of American F-35 fighter jets.
Few analysts ever imagined Canada emerging as a producer and exporter of fighter jets for NATO. For decades, the country has been viewed as a buyer rather than a builder, a dependable partner that purchases proven aircraft from allies rather than shaping the industrial backbone behind them. Yet a quiet shift is taking form, one that moves advanced military manufacturing north of the border and places a European-designed fighter jet on Canadian assembly lines. Not an American flagship program, not a Lockheed Martin logo, but Sweden's Gripen rolling out of Ontario facilities with Canadian stamp and a potential customer list stretching across Eastern and Central Europe. Poland, Romania, and even Germany appear in speculative discussions. What once sounded implausible now carries strategic weight. If such a development came to pass, the implications would extend far beyond aircraft procurement. It would reshape NATO's internal balance, challenge long-standing assumptions about U.S. defense dominance, and force the alliance to reconsider Canada's role within it. To understand how the scenario even enters a realm of possibility, it is necessary to look at the reality Canada faces today. Canada's fighter replacement plan, centered on the F-35, has grown heavier with each new assessment. The Auditor General of Canada's June 2025 report placed projected costs at 27.7 billion Canadian dollars, up from the original 19 billion estimate, with long-term infrastructure and sustainment potentially pushing the total beyond 33 billion. Numbers of that scale inevitably change the conversation. What once appeared to be a routine modernization effort now looks like a structural commitment with consequences lasting generations. Defense analysts increasingly describe Ottawa's position as a paradox. Spending continues to rise, yet control continues to shrink. The F-35 is embedded in a global supply network coordinated by Lockheed Martin. Software updates flow through U.S. military approval channels. Maintenance timelines, data access, and mission systems are governed by rules defined in Washington. Canada pays the bill, but authority over critical systems remains elsewhere. In that environment, uncomfortable questions become unavoidable. If tens of billions are already being spent, why not direct that investment towards something Canada can shape and manage? If factories must be built, why should they exist solely to support foreign control program? Those questions open the door to a scenario that would have sounded unthinkable a decade ago. Instead of completing the purchase of 88 F-35s, Canada pivots and signs a comprehensive agreement with Sweden Saab to produce the Gripen E domestically. Not limited final assembly and not imported airframes, but full-scale production supported by meaningful technology transfer. Engines, avionics integration, electronic warfare systems, and advanced composite manufacturing would all move into Canadian hands. International observers would likely describe such an agreement as historic. Sweden would gain a North American production partner, while Canada would reclaim a military aviation capability lost in the late 1950s after the cancellation of the CF-105 Aero. That alone would be enough to send shockwaves through defense circles. Yet the most consequential element would lie deeper in the arrangement. Under this hypothetical framework, Canada would receive export rights to sell the Gripen to other NATO members. Companies such as Bombardier and CAE would no longer function only as subcontractors within foreign supply chains. They would become certified defense manufacturers with authority over production, sustainment, and future upgrades. This would represent a fundamental break from Canada's post-Cold War defense posture. Analysts emphasize that this goes far beyond the purchase of an aircraft. It establishes a foundation for a sovereign sustainment model. Production, maintenance, and long-term modernization remain under Canadian authority rather than external control. In practical terms, this could mean Ontario-based facilities where Canadian engineers work alongside Saab specialists shaping composite airframes. Power plants sourced through partnerships Canada negotiates directly rather than through American prime contractors. Radar and electronic warfare systems built on Swedish designs, but adapted and upgraded in Montreal by CAE teams. Software control stands out as a particularly decisive factor. The F F-35 operates as a closed system managed by Lockheed Martin. The Gripen, by contrast, was designed around an open architecture. If Canadian forces needed to modify mission systems for Arctic operations or unique national requirements, those changes could be implemented without seeking approval from Washington. Control of source code becomes more than a technical detail. It becomes a symbol of strategic independence, of course. Theory rarely unfolds without friction. A shift of this magnitude would demand a transformation not seen in Canada since the Second World War. Economists estimate that a Gripen production line could generate between 15,000 and 20,000 direct jobs. These roles would span aerospace engineering, precision manufacturing, defense software development, and systems integration. Bombardier, once a producer of the CF-100 before exiting defense aviation, could return to a sector it helped shape. CAE, already a global leader in flight simulation, would move from supporting roles into core partnership. Pratt & Whitney Canada, traditionally focused on civilian engines, could explore expansion into military propulsion. Job creation, however, tells only part of the story. Building fighter jets requires a deep and resilient supply chain. Aviation-grade metals, advanced composites, secure electronics, and military-certified components all demand rigorous standards. Hundreds of small and mid-sized firms would need to upgrade facilities and processes to meet NATO requirements, effectively creating a national defense industrial ecosystem. At that stage, the discussion shifts away from cost alone and toward technological sovereignty. The ripple effects would not stop at Canada's borders. Canadian-built Gripens entering service would inevitably draw attention across NATO. Smaller European air forces seeking alternatives to U.S. systems might see Canada as a politically neutral supplier within the alliance. For Washington, the development would raise difficult questions about industrial dominance and alliance management. For NATO as a whole, it would test whether the alliance is prepared for a more distributed model of defense production. What begins as a procurement dilemma thus evolves into a strategic crossroads. Canada's choice is no longer just about replacing aging fighters. It is about deciding whether to remain a consumer within someone else's system or to reassert itself as a sovereign industrial power within NATO. Defense analysts often identify three distinct groups of potential buyers who would closely watch a Canadian-built Gripen program. The first group includes Eastern European nations such as Poland and Romania. These countries are expanding their air forces under real and immediate security pressure, yet they must do so within constrained defense budgets. Publicly available estimates place the Gripen's operating cost at roughly $8,000 per flight hour, compared with figures that range from $35,000 to more than $45,000 for the F-35. That gap is not abstract. For air forces that need pilots flying regularly to maintain readiness, operating costs directly shape how much combat power they can afford in practice. A Canadian-produced fighter, certified to NATO standards and backed by a stable industrial base, could appear as a pragmatic and politically safe option. The second group of potential buyers would likely include Nordic countries interested in diversifying their defense supply chains. Finland, now firmly inside NATO, has long emphasized autonomy and flexibility in its military planning. Even nations that already operate advanced aircraft have reasons to avoid over-reliance on a single supplier. A dependable production partner in North America, operated within NATO frameworks but outside direct U.S. industrial control, could appeal to policymakers seeking balance rather than replacement. The third group may be the most unexpected. Several NATO members continue to operate aging F-16 fleets and face difficult choices about modernization. Fully committing to the F-35 brings not only high acquisition costs but also decades of dependence on a tightly controlled system. A modernized Gripen offers an alternative path, allowing air forces to upgrade capabilities without locking themselves into a single long-term supplier. For governments juggling domestic politics, budget realities, and alliance expectations, that flexibility matters. Stepping back, the implications of the scenario become striking. Canada has traditionally framed itself as a middle power focused on diplomacy, multilateralism, and peacekeeping. Becoming an exporter of advanced fighter jets would represent a profound shift in identity and policy. Strategy researchers have raised questions about readiness for such a role. If a country like Poland placed an order for dozens of Canadian-built Gripens, Ottawa would need to expand export control regimes, define technology transfer limits, and accept political responsibility for how these aircraft are ultimately used. When weapons manufactured in Canada appear in active conflict zones, accountability inevitably follows. Economic incentives, however, remain powerful. Industry estimates suggest that selling roughly 200 Gripens to NATO partners over 20 years could generate between 25 and 30 billion Canadian dollars in revenue. That scale of income supports long-term employment, stabilizes advanced manufacturing, and helps retain highly skilled engineers and technicians who often migrate to the United States in search of opportunity. It would also anchor a domestic aerospace ecosystem capable of surviving beyond a single procurement cycle. Yet every benefit carries a counterweight. Geopolitics would quickly move to the foreground. If Canada entered the fighter export market, Washington's response would be complex and layered. Lockheed Martin would face the loss of a major contract, while watching a European competitor gain ground within NATO. Lobbying efforts would likely intensify, with arguments framed around interoperability risks or alliance cohesion. The Pentagon could raise its own concerns. NATO's defense architecture has long been built around U.S.-led systems, from communication standards to identification technologies. A wider mix of platforms might complicate coordination, training, and logistics at the same time. Some American strategists could see strategic upside. If Canada assumed greater responsibility for supplying and sustaining NATO air power, U.S. resources might be freed for other priorities. In Washington, attention is increasingly focused on Pacific, where competition with China shapes long-term planning. In that context, a more capable and industrially independent Canada could be viewed not as a rival, but as a burden-sharing partner. These contradictions highlight how international politics rarely produces clean outcomes. Looking further ahead, a successful Canadian Gripen program would influence national identity as much as defense policy.